Thank you very much for the kind presentation and invitation to your seminar series. Yes, today I will present research from my ongoing project on female sailors, specifically Nordic women who, during the long 19th century, disguised themselves as men to work at sea. And I have been working for a few months on this project. And this might seem like a marginal topic, but it connects to broader questions that remain highly relevant today. At its core, it's about social inclusion, who gets to be part of history, and how we tell those stories. And as humanists, we can contribute by questioning dominant narratives and bringing forward the lives and experiences that have been overlooked. And this is particularly relevant in the field of maritime history, because for a long time, the focus has been on ships, on technology, on battles, captains, male explorers, and so on, framing the sea as an exclusively male space. But is that really the whole story? Have women not also been part of this world? Well, yes, in many ways. But even though women have taken part in many areas of the maritime economy, as I will show you soon, the traces can be hard to find. Earlier research rarely looked for women in these male-dominant settings, or their presence was not expected. Most historical records were once created by men, and women's contributions, especially informal or unexpected ones, were rarely documented. So traces of women in the maritime world are often scattered in the archives and require us to use broader methods and source perspectives to find them. But women have always been part of the maritime world, often in roles that haven't been fully acknowledged. There have, for instance, been famous figures symbolic of female rebellion at sea, like Mary Read and Bonnie, who defied gender norms by living as pirates. In the Nordic countries, women have been participating in different ways in coastal and fishing economies. There are regions where women have served as skippers and helmswomen in rowing boats, fished alongside men, and been respected for their seamanship. Women have been part of family businesses, operating ships together and combining both shipboard duties and economic decision-making. In 18th and 19th century port cities, women ran businesses that catered to the maritime world, such as sailmaking or lodging houses. And some even owned shared in ships or entire vessels and acted as investors and entrepreneurs. With the rise of steamships in the early 19th century, women began working as stewardesses on passenger vessels. And on 20th century military context, women were also employed as nurses and clerks aboard naval ships, especially during the World Wars. Captains' wives occasionally joined trade or whaling expeditions. Some learned navigation and sailing and could form a kind of informal crew, sometimes acting as de facto captains, as I will show examples of. Women also ran labor-intensive rowing and transport services in urban harbors, such as the Rodarmadammer in Gothenburg and Stockholm, or vevkullor. And finally, a central focus of this project is women who worked as sailors while disguised as men. And these were women who challenged boundaries directly and embodied both resistance and adaptation within the maritime world. But why did they do this? Why did some girls and women leave their lives, families, and networks on land to take on a secret male identities on sea? Well, partly it was a response to exclusion. Disguise was often the only way to enter a profession close to women. The very need to disguise oneself shows how restricted parts of the maritime labor market was to women. But there were also personal motivations, perhaps ambition, the need to escape, finding new ways of provision, better jobs and pay, or the longing for adventure or freedom. Research from the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands show that this was not a unique phenomenon to the Nordic context. It was spread. So across times and regions, women played active roles in seafaring and military life, sometimes in disguise. And this recurring pattern has been called a deviant tradition, or the normal exceptional, something special, yet not isolated. So these women weren't just anomalies, they were part of a larger phenomenon shaped by gender, class, and opportunity. But why are these women in disguise worth of our academical attention? Why are they worthy to study? Why should we engage with what seems like a marginal practice? Well, because by including voices from the margins, we gain a fuller understanding of how maritime space and labor were shaped and reshaped. By studying those who crossed these boundaries, we see how the sea gradually opened up for women. And even if they were few, their actions helped make seafaring a possible and eventually accepted profession for women. So understanding this tradition helps us rethink the maritime past, not as a sealed-off male domain, but as a space shaped by struggle, negotiation, and the courage to cross boundaries. And before we move on, let's briefly situate ourselves in the long 19th century, a period of major transformation central to this project. First, maritime technology changed. The age of sail gave way to steam and motor power, reshaping maritime labor and opening up new roles for women, especially in service. Second, the press was modernized and expanded dramatically. Newspapers became more numerous, faster, and more widely read, shaping public opinion and spreading new ideas. Third, new middle-class ideals emerged, placing women in the home as caretakers and moral guardians. Yet, at the same time, these ideals were being challenged by growing movements for female emancipation. So this was a contradictory period where old norms persisted, but new cracks opened in the structure, allowing something else to take shape. While disguised women are often invisible in conventional archives, they left footprints elsewhere, especially in the press. And thanks to digitization, I can now map these traces across time and borders more systematically. And the main types of texts that emerge in the newspapers when searching for female sailors in disguise are news items about girls and women whose identities have been revealed or they reveal themselves, both domestic but also reports on foreign cases. There are fictional stories, sometimes serialized, and there are debate articles. And newspapers have been a key to understanding how gender roles were reinforced, debated, and sometimes broken. And I will continue by give you some examples of the material I have found and how it can be interpreted, what it might tell us. And I will start by showing an example of a foreign news in Sweden. And this is also an example of the repetition in the press. So the same news were often spread to tens and tens of newspapers, sometimes as exact copies, sometimes with varied information. And this is a notice originally from Liverpool about Anne Stewart, who had worked 5 years as a seaman, but was exposed after a fall in which she broke a rib. And there are both similarities and variation in these notices about the same news. For instance, in how newspapers chose to frame the story differently through the more matter-of-fact headlines to more literal headlines. The geist is the same, but there are slight variations in the descriptions of her character as a working sailor, capable and fearless, capable and courageous, skilled and resourceful. And not infrequently, as here, the girls' skill, courage, and swiftness as sailors are emphasized. They are often described as at least as good or better than their shipmates. Another aspect often emphasized is appearance. You can see that she was described as beautiful, but why would this be important to write? Well, I think this was a way to signal her good character. Still in the 1800s, people's outer appearance was considered mirroring their inner qualities and character. So in this case, that she was beautiful signals that she was not a fallen, immoral woman, but a virtuous and independent individual. In 1855, Swedish newspapers reported the case of a 17-year-old girl from the island of Öland who had been discovered working as a cabin boy aboard a Swedish schooner. And the story appeared in several papers with slight variations in the details, and I have blended quotes from multiple sources here. And what's remarkable is that the motive was made clear. Johanna Sophia had disguised herself not to escape punishment or poverty, but out of an interest in seafaring. She signed on in maid clothing because she felt drawn to the sailor's profession. After her identity was revealed, the crew and especially the captain was astonished. One paper noted that she had climbed up to the main top more swiftly than many a genuine seaman. And according to the Middle newspaper, she was sent home to Öland in women's clothing, where she would presumably choose an occupation more suitable to her sex, provided that the desire for life at sea does not return. So here, the newspaper even suggested that the new attire might not be an obstacle to such a return, pointing to opportunities for women, probably within aboard service. The last newspaper, however, took another tone, and they ask, "For the girl yearning for life at sea, there remains no other option than to place herself as a wife under the protection of a male seafarer." In other words, she could only return to sea by marrying a sailor and work under his command. And this event, one conservative newspaper, they call this comic. Another liberal paper, they instead defended this woman. And they meant that she had committed no offense other than having gone to sea and there promptly and willingly fulfilled her obligations. So they write rhetorically, "Is it therefore a criminal offense that a woman embarks on an occupation which the man has declared to be solely for his benefit?" And they refer to that women around the world are starting to engage in traditionally male jobs and wonder, how great a crime can it then be if a woman were to take up a position as a cabin boy on a ship? Another short news item from 1871 reports on a second girl from Öland who had been working in disguise as a sailor. For 8 years, she served as both an ordinary and able seaman and had even crossed the equator twice. And this suggests not only experience, but a clear progression in rank and responsibility. Her long service implies that she fully mastered the skills and routines of shipboard life. She was, in every practical sense, a competent and capable sailor. Interestingly, after her gender was discovered, she continued working, this time openly as a woman, on the steamer Visby, operating in the Baltic Sea. So this indicates that while women may have been accepted on board in service roles, the position of sailor still required passing as male. But I can't help but wonder how the crew on Visby reacted to her presence. What did they think about her? Was her experience as sailor respected? And hopefully my further archival research will allow me to return with more details about both of these girls from Öland. Towards the end of the 19th century, new types of news began to appear in Swedish newspapers, news that likely influenced the discussion on female emancipation and the opportunities available for women in the workforce. And the notices reveal how women were starting to internationally be accepted, or at least expressing interest in applying for command of a ship. One Miss Poole has become a mate on a steamer in the United States, and one Miss Barton wants to do the same. And such news will undoubtedly have an impact on women in Sweden and the rest of the world as an inspiration. Debate pieces concerning whether women should or were able to work as sailors or not are aired in the press. Here is a piece that advocates women's right to work in the maritime trade. And they state that, as far as the mere navigation of a vessel is concerned, there is no reason whatsoever to claim that women could not accomplish the same as men. And they point to that it is the fact that the wives of sea captains are not infrequently more skilled than their husbands in handling nautical instruments. So they point out that navigation nowadays required skill, not brute strength. And interestingly enough, they end the piece by talking about marriage. One argument against women working aboard would possibly be that she would thereby diminish her prospects of marriage and fulfilling the role of the ideal woman. The text argues for the opposite. They mean that the fresh, clean air and the simple work of life at sea would, in the shortest time, turn even a woman not particularly blessed with outward beauty into a true phenomenon of health and radiant vitality, thereby greatly improving her chances of finding a husband. So they say that working as a sailor would increase her health and beauty and helping her turn into the married ideal woman. Here we see an example of a woman's excellent seamanship. There's a young woman, Miss Skoglund. She demonstrated extraordinary bravery and seamanship when the ship Vega from Hudiksvall was wrecked in the Baltic Sea and rescued by a Norse ship, Flora. Miss Skoglund had been sailing with her father for 12 years, and she was praised by the rescuers as the most capable sailor aboard. Miss Skoglund tries to steer the disabled ship herself, and she also managed to save the ship's documents. She was brought aboard the rescue vessel Flora, dressed in man's attire, where her courage earned widespread admiration. And this case also illustrates how sailors' daughters or wives could master maritime skills, and how a father may have actually helped disguise his daughter as a boy. Or perhaps she thought that men's clothing was more practical to her. Now a few words on sea fiction. Because fiction has long been an important part of newspaper content, especially in the form of feuilletons. And the fictional stories are highly relevant to use as historical source, particularly when it comes to disguised women. The nature of fiction was hybrid, since it combined real historical events with fictional elements. So fiction often drew from real-life cases and in turn inspired other girls and women to follow in their footsteps. And I have traced and analyzed 4 Swedish fictional texts that feature a disguised female sailor as either the main or a supporting character. And my focus has, for instance, been on how seamanship and transformation are represented. And there are interesting similarities between these stories. Concerning seamanship, before the transformation into a man takes place, all 4 girls show a strong connection to the sea. They have a knowledge of rowing and sailing, they have an interest in boats, and a longing for maritime life. Some even earn money on rowing before they even set foot on a larger ship. So the leap into mastering as a man may not have been such a large step. The characters, they share several physical traits in how appearance, physique, and body are described. 3 have black and curly hair. Their inner strength is said radiating from their eyes. Their hands have transformed from white, soft, caressing women's hands into tanned and able sailors' hands, markers of their working identity. They're seen as beautiful, but in a boyish and unconventional way, and perhaps this was to justify both their boyish maritime interests and the plausibility of their disguise. The morals of the stories, they vary somewhat, but aboard the ship, the female sailors are described as skilled and swift, as competent and capable as any other sailor in the crew. 3 out of the 4 texts also highlight another important aspect of good seamanship, which is comradeship, where the needs of the crew come before the individual. And overall, their work is portrayed in a positive light. They demonstrate resourcefulness, independence, and responsibility, contributing to society through their work rather than remaining idle or dependent. And the authors for these stories, they also show similarities in their connection to the coast, their own professional experience, or the family's relationship to seafaring. So maybe the authors were fictionalizing an oral and written tradition, or perhaps even personal experiences. And we will take a brief look on one of the characters from one of the stories from 1848. She was called Mama Mate. She was a shipmate. And this is interesting because we can see how this fictional character Mama Mate lives on in the press from 1848 and forward. She becomes an input in the debate. So the name Mama Mate endured as a concept, continuing into the 1920s to discuss and explore women's role and work at sea. And as we see on the slide, the concept is used in 1869 as a warning example when a person lifts a concern about the potential disruption of a traditional gender roles, fearing that it could go too far. Good heavens, what happy times it will be when every woman becomes such a mama mate. In contrast, the concept is used to describe a British heroine in 1872, a sailor's wife who, when everybody aboard the ship falls ill and even dies in the Atlantic, she takes command of the vessel. So she showed, in the face of these dangers, the greatest courage and displayed a presence and experience that would have honored an old sea dog. And the concept of mama mate is even turned into a role model in new feuilletons. So here in 1886, a girl wants to become an excellent sailor, just like mama mate. She reads sea novels and gets inspired. She imagined being able to do the same as mama mate, and why shouldn't she be able to? And the story of Mama Mate becomes even more compelling when we consider that she was likely inspired by a real Swedish girl sailing in disguise in the 1700s with a link to Gothenburg. So yes, this story may well be continued after further archival work. But I know, at least today, that her legacy already rippled far beyond her time. Through fiction and popular memory, figures like Mama Mate carried these hidden stories forward into new generations. So these women left their mark. What began as a survival became a part of a lasting change. So they moved through oceans of exclusion, reshaping the maritime world, and as they gradually opened up the sea, the need for disguise faded. And I will stop by show you some preliminary conclusions, some preliminary findings so far. And the practice of women passing as male sailors was reported in newspapers, and this indicates that it was a matter of public interest. But at the same time, these stories don't come across as particularly sensational. They often appear under general headlines like various matters or miscellaneous. They are told in a quite matter-of-fact tone. They are usually hidden between other content. The reports are usually neutral. They can be positive, but also, as we have seen, editorials sometimes express skepticism. There are also debate articles, both supporting and opposing the idea of women working as sailors. We still don't know how common it was, how many women that sailed as men, but perhaps that's not the most important point. As I mentioned earlier, I believe that even individual women disguising to work at sea were part of a larger practice that caused ripples over time. Their actions sparked discussion in the press, were fictionalized in popular culture, and this contributed to change. And this also means that newspapers aren't just source materials for us as historians today. At the time, they were an active arena for spreading knowledge about women who crossed gender boundaries in the workforce. And newspapers served as a driving force in shaping public conversations about women's roles, both in society more broadly and within the maritime profession specifically. And furthermore, I believe it's important to make the effort to seek out traces of people who were likely marginalized in their time and who left only faint footprints for us to find today. If we can bring the stories together and recognize their actions and experiences, it will help us write a more inclusive maritime history. And there's one remaining challenge, and it is to continue integrating gender and other less known aspects into maritime history, not as a separate subfield, but as a natural and essential part of the broader narrative. Thank you.